One of the most well-known and devastating conflicts of Saddam Hussein was his long and bitter fight against the United States. American soldiers, especially those who fought in the Gulf War and the Iraq War, faced extreme violence under Saddam's forces. The first major conflict between Saddam Hussein and the U.S. military began in 1990. The world was shocked when Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein, invaded Kuwait on August 2, 1990. At that time, Saddam believed that by taking over Kuwait, he could control even more of the region's oil resources. Iraq had an army of roughly 500,000 soldiers, and Saddam thought that his military strength would be enough to secure his gains without much interference. However, the international community, led by the United States, did not agree with his plans. The United Nations condemned the invasion and passed resolutions demanding Iraq's withdrawal. Within days of the invasion, the U.S. government under President George H.W. Bush realized that Saddam's actions were not just about land, but had the potential to destabilize an entire region that was vital for the world's energy supplies. In response, American military leaders began planning a rapid buildup of forces in Saudi Arabia, which borders Kuwait. The United States, along with forces from 33 other nations, quickly mobilized. Over 750,000 coalition troops, including roughly 380,000 American soldiers, were sent to the region. As tensions escalated over the following months, Iraq's occupation of Kuwait led to economic sanctions and growing international pressure. Military preparations continued on both sides. The coalition forces sharpened their strategies and rehearsed operations in the desert environment of the Gulf. The buildup in Saudi Arabia was one of the largest deployments of troops in history, and it was clear that a military confrontation was coming. By January 1991, all the preparations resulted in a massive military campaign known as Operation Desert Storm. The operation began on January 17, 1991, with an extensive air campaign. Over the course of several weeks, more than 1,000 aircraft from the United States and its allies took off to target Iraqi military installations. The airstrikes were carefully planned to hit key targets such as air bases, communication centers, radar installations, and supply lines. The idea was to cripple Saddam's ability to coordinate and fight, even before any ground forces were deployed. In one operation that lasted for nearly 6 weeks, the coalition systematically destroyed hundreds of military sites across Iraq. On January 18, 1991, a U.S. fighter jet was shot down near the Iraqi capital of Baghdad. The crew of that jet, including Lieutenant Colonel Clifford Acri and Chief Warrant Officer Guy Hunter Jr., was captured by Iraqi forces. Reports from that time indicate that once in Iraqi custody, these American soldiers were subjected to severe mistreatment. They were beaten repeatedly, starved, and in some cases tortured in ways that left deep physical and mental scars. It is said that during their captivity, the soldiers suffered from broken bones, electric shocks, and the denial of any meaningful medical care. As the air campaign continued, coalition forces relentlessly targeted Iraqi military infrastructure. Thousands of sorties were flown over Iraqi territory, and in many cases, precision-guided munitions were used to hit targets with remarkable accuracy. The technological edge was one of the key reasons the coalition could inflict such significant damage on Saddam's forces. The Iraqi military, although large in numbers, was not prepared for the scale or the sophistication of the attacks. Many of their key installations were destroyed, leaving their forces disorganized and unable to respond effectively. Within weeks, the air campaign had severely weakened the backbone of Saddam's military. The successful air campaign eventually set the stage for the ground offense, which began in February 1991. By this time, the Iraqi military was already in disarray. The coalition's strategy had effectively neutralized many of Saddam's combat capabilities, and the Iraqi forces were struggling to keep up with the fast-moving and technologically superior enemy. As ground troops advanced into Kuwait and southern Iraq, the remnants of Saddam's forces tried to put up a fight, but they were largely overwhelmed. In a matter of weeks, the coalition forces had liberated Kuwait and pushed deep into Iraqi territory. After the war ended in late February 1991, the surviving prisoners were released, and the full scope of the conflict began to sink in. In late 1998, Tensions between Iraq and the United States were still very high as Saddam continued to defy international demands by refusing to allow UN inspectors to verify that his regime was not developing weapons of mass destruction. The situation reached a boiling point in December 1998 when President Bill Clinton decided that strong action was needed. This decision led to the launch of a 4-day military campaign known as Operation Desert Fox, which took place from December 16th to December 19, 1998. The goal of Operation Desert Fox was to weaken Saddam's military capabilities and disrupt any programs that might lead to the production of weapons of mass destruction. In a carefully planned air campaign, American and British forces coordinated a series of strikes against key military sites in Iraq. Hundreds of precision-guided missiles and bombs were used to hit targets such as communication centers, command and control facilities, and suspected chemical and biological weapons production sites. During the operation, the Iraqi military was on high alert. Saddam Hussein had not been idle in preparing for a potential American response. His regime had invested in robust air defense systems, including surface-to-air missile batteries like SA-2, SA-3, and SA-6, as well as early warning radars. These systems were positioned to protect critical military sites and to challenge any foreign air incursions. On several occasions, during the 4-day campaign, American pilots flying advanced aircraft, such as F-15s and F-16s, faced the threat of being targeted by these defenses. The pilots relied on state-of-the-art radar warning receivers, electronic countermeasures, and evasive tactics to avoid being hit. Although the Iraqi defenses managed to launch several missile salvos during the strikes, the American aircraft were able to escape thanks to superior technology and expert flying skills. Saddam Hussein was known for his bold and aggressive propaganda tactics, and during Operation Desert Fox, he issued orders that added an extra layer of tension to the mission. He declared that if any American pilot's plane were shot down, the pilot must be captured and brought to him personally. Saddam saw this as an opportunity to use the capture of American pilots as a powerful propaganda tool. He believed that displaying a downed U.S. pilot would not only humiliate the United States, but also serve to rally his supporters at home. However, during the operation, despite the heightened threat and the active engagement of Iraqi air defenses, no American pilot was captured. The mission planners knew that one of Saddam's most desperate moves could be to try to capture downed American pilots, so they took extra precautions. Aircraft were equipped with enhanced communication systems and tracking devices to ensure that if the plane was hit, rescue teams could be quickly dispatched. In addition, pilots were drilled in evasive maneuvers and countermeasures that made it extremely difficult for Iraqi surface-to-air missiles to find a clear target. This level of preparation helped ensure that even when Iraqi defenses fired, the pilots had the best possible chance of evading capture. By 2003, suspicions had been growing that Saddam Hussein's regime was secretly building weapons of mass destruction. The United States and its allies believed that Saddam was hiding dangerous chemical, biological, or even nuclear weapons that could threaten not only the region, but also the entire world. On March 20th, 2003, these suspicions led to the launch of Operation Iraqi Freedom. This military campaign was designed to remove Saddam from power and to stop what was seen as an imminent threat from a rogue regime. When the invasion began, American forces, along with troops from several allied nations, quickly moved into Iraq. Modern technology, precise weapons, and superior planning gave them an early advantage. Helicopters and fighter jets flew in formations designed to keep the enemy off balance, and American tanks and armored vehicles rolled in rapidly to secure key positions. Despite the overwhelming military strength of the coalition, Saddam's forces did not simply surrender. Instead, they resorted to tactics meant to slow down the advance and to create chaos on the battlefield. Saddam's military strategy at this time was a mix of conventional and guerrilla-style warfare. Instead of setting up large, organized defenses, many Iraqi soldiers and paramilitary groups engaged in ambushes, sniping, and the placement of roadside bombs. These tactics were designed to exploit the vulnerabilities of a fast-moving, modern army that was not accustomed to fighting in an urban environment or against hit-and-run attacks. One particular area where these tactics had a dramatic effect was in the southern city of Nasiriyah. On March 23, 2003, a U.S. Army supply convoy was ambushed near Nasiriyah. The city had long been a strategic point in the region due to its road networks and proximity to oil fields. The ambush took place when the convoy, which was carrying essential supplies for the advancing troops, encountered a well-prepared enemy force. Iraqi fighters had positioned themselves along the road, hidden behind buildings and natural cover. They waited for the convoy to pass and then launched a surprise attack using sniper fire, small arms, and improvised explosive devices hidden along the roadside. The ambush was sudden and brutal. In a matter of minutes, the convoy came under heavy fire. Chaos erupted on the dusty road. Reports indicate that 11 American soldiers lost their lives during the ambush. In addition to the fatalities, 5 American soldiers were taken prisoner by Iraqi forces. One of the most well-known and controversial stories to emerge from this ambush was that of Private Jessica Lynch. Jessica was a young soldier who had just joined the U.S. Army, and her capture quickly became a focal point for media coverage. According to initial reports, she was taken to an Iraqi hospital where her captors hoped to use her image as part of their propaganda efforts. The Iraqi government claimed that she was treated well. However, it was revealed later that Jessica Lynch had been severely beaten and mistreated by her captors. The situation for the captured soldiers was dire. American military protocols and international laws are very clear about the humane treatment of prisoners of war, but the ambush of Nasiriyah showed that not all captors were willing to follow these rules. Iraqi forces, under orders from high-level commanders and with Saddam's own aggressive directives in mind, often treated their prisoners quite harshly. In another tragic episode linked to this ambush, 2 American soldiers, Sergeant Donald Walters and Private First Class Patrick Miller, were captured in the same attack. Unlike some of their comrades who were eventually rescued, the fate of these 2 soldiers was even more grim. Reports indicate that Sergeant Walters was separated from his unit during the confusion of the ambush. Once in Iraqi custody, he fell into the hands of Iraqi intelligence officers who saw an opportunity to further their propaganda goals. Later, his body was discovered with multiple gunshot wounds, a clear sign that he had been executed rather than simply left to suffer the indignities of captivity. The American POWs, many of whom were taken in the early days of the conflict, experienced conditions that went far beyond the acceptable standards laid out in the Geneva Conventions. These soldiers were beaten, starved, and forced to appear on Iraqi television. Their captors paraded them in front of cameras, displaying their swollen faces and black eyes as a means of propaganda. Once captured, the POWs were often subjected to relentless physical abuse. Reports from several soldiers described being beaten with rifle butts and other blunt instruments. In many cases, the captors denied the prisoners food and water, leaving them in a state of starvation that further weakened their resistance. This deliberate mistreatment was intended to force the prisoners into giving false confessions, often about crimes that had never been committed. Iraqi interrogators threatened many of the captives with death if they did not cooperate, using both physical and psychological tactics to coerce compliance. One particularly gruesome example of this abuse involved Chief Warrant Officer Ronald Young Jr. and Chief Warrant Officer David Williams, 2 U.S. Army pilots who were shot down on March 24, 2003. Their aircraft was intercepted during the intense aerial battles of the invasion, and they were subsequently captured by Iraqi forces. What followed was a period of severe and brutal mistreatment that would leave long-lasting marks on both their bodies and minds. According to multiple reports, their captors used rifle butts to break their ribs. In addition to the physical assault, the 2 pilots were tied up and forced to remain in stress positions for days on end. These positions, often designed to be physically exhausting and painful, served to worsen their injuries and further diminish their ability to resist their captors. The use of stress positions in captivity is a method known to cause significant physical harm over time. When forced to hold an unnatural posture for extended periods, the body experiences severe strain, leading to muscle fatigue, joint pain, and, in some cases, permanent damage. The lack of proper nutrition and care led to rapid physical deterioration. In some instances, the conditions were so harsh that the POWs became seriously ill or suffered from infections that could have been easily treated under normal conditions. The rescue of some of these prisoners, such as the eventual liberation of Young and Williams when Baghdad fell in April 2003, brought some relief after months of suffering. However, the physical injuries and emotional scars left by the abuse took much longer to heal. On April 9, 2003, the long reign of Saddam Hussein began to crumble as U.S. forces entered Baghdad. That day, after weeks of intense fighting and uncertainty, American and coalition troops finally broke through the defenses of the Iraqi capital. As they advanced into the city, many Iraqis took to the streets in celebration, hoping that the fall of Baghdad would bring to an end years of brutal dictatorship and suffering. The collapse of Saddam's government was dramatic and sudden. Even as Baghdad was liberated, Saddam Hussein was nowhere to be found. Instead of confronting the invaders, he went into hiding. For several months after the fall of the capital, Saddam moved from place to place, seeking refuge in underground bunkers and farmhouses in rural areas. His network of loyal supporters tried to keep his presence a secret, and his hideouts were often in remote locations that were difficult for coalition forces to search thoroughly. The dictator managed to elude capture by using a series of safe houses and secret tunnels, staying away from the public eye as long as he could. Finally, on December 13, 2003, U.S. soldiers found Saddam Hussein near Tikrit, a city in northern Iraq that had long been known as a stronghold of support for his regime. The soldiers discovered him in a small, dim space that some described as a hole or hideout. At that moment, after months of evading capture, the dictator was taken into custody without a fight. There was no dramatic shootout or violent confrontation at that time. Instead, his capture was nearly anticlimactic. He was simply found and arrested by U.S. forces. He was put on trial for crimes against humanity, a process that took several years and involved intense legal scrutiny. The trial focused on many of the terrible crimes he had committed over his decades-long rule, including the mass killings, brutal repression, and widespread human rights abuses he inflicted on his own people. Although there was plenty of evidence and documentation of his abuses against American soldiers during the 2003 invasion, the trial was primarily concerned with the atrocities committed against Iraqi citizens. These crimes included the violent suppression of uprisings, the use of chemical weapons against civilians, and the systematic persecution of entire communities. After months of legal arguments and deliberations, the trial concluded with Saddam Hussein being found guilty of crimes against humanity. On December 30, 2006, the sentence was carried out as Saddam was executed by hanging. The execution took place in a prison courtyard in Baghdad, where a small group of witnesses observed the event. The day marked the final end of a dictator who had once ruled with an iron fist and whose actions had left deep scars on the nation.